Chapter 1.2, Form, Volume, Mass, and Texture. So now that we are going to kind of shift gears and look at three-dimensional works of art, where our terminology of the work is going to change. So with three-dimensional art, we have height, width, and depth. So the four of the visual elements, form, value, mass, and texture, are the new terms that we're going to talk about in this section. So with form, if we think about two-dimensional objects, they're considered shapes. With a three-dimensional object, we're going to call it a form. So with form, you have two basic attributes, which is the volume, the amount of space that it occupies, or the mass, the volume is solid and it occupies that space. So here in the Great Sphinx of Giza, you look at the Great Sphinx, and this is the largest carving of the world that's made out of a single stone. In this piece, you see an example of a geometric form. So instead of saying a geometric shape, we understand that it's a form because it's three-dimensional. So that's how your terminology will change when you're talking and analyzing the work. So when we start talking about geometric forms in our analysis, we're going to make sure to change the vocabulary to like cubes, spheres, cylinders, cones. So here in David Smith's piece, you see where he combines geometric forms in angular relationships. So he uses the cubes, the cuboids, and then a thick disc. If you also see like the diagonal angles in the piece, it does imply movement. So now you're making that connection of the other elements where we talk about line, we talk about other things, contrast, and those things, balance. You're going to be able to implement them into this work as well. An organic form are things that are basically from the natural world. So they're irregular and they're unpredictable things in nature. The living things and their forms are changing constantly. We can consider them organic forms. Usually an artist will use organic forms for expressive effect. So if you would think about the geometric form, they're just very planned, predictable, and so they have a very different feel. Whereas in organic form, it lends itself to expression, right? And so here in this figure, the artist is using these organic forms, and so carves the bodies of Mary and Jesus in these really irregular, awkward, and distorted way. But the reasoning behind that is because the artist is expressing this idea of agony and death and grief. Organic forms lend themselves more for expressive qualities. In sculpture, we'll also talk about the relief and sculptures in the round. So a relief is basically a piece that is only to be seen from one side and one side only. So part of it will be flat, be a flat surface. And a form in the round is going to be something that you can see from all sides. So for example, here, this would be an example of a relief. The back is flat, and so you can't see behind it. You only see the front. So it's only from one side. You can only view it from the front side. This is another example of a relief, only seen from one side. And then this is an example of a sculpture in the round. So you can view it from all sides, you can walk around it. And so as you walk around the piece, you're going to find different things and see like the piece in different perspective, right? And so it's going to challenge, kind of reveal new things to you and aspects of the work. So with volume is the amount of space occupied by an object. So solid objects have volume. So do objects that enclose an empty space. They have volume as well. So with open volume is when an artist encloses a space with material that is not completely solid. They're creating an open volume. And so this is an example of open volume. This is Ralph Helmick and Stuart Schitzer Ghostwriter. So when the artist encloses this space, they're not completely solid, but they still create volume. And so as you look at this piece from far away, you can see like the suspended metal pieces, and you can see kind of the idea of this shape of a large human head that is implied. But when you look closer, and you'll notice that all these metal pieces and objects are just small objects hanging from there. So when you look at it from far away, you will see the form of the head. This is in the blue crest, and again, an open volume. You can still, it's not solid, so it's open. With mass, it suggests that something is solid and occupies space. But just remember that mass can suggest weight, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it implies heaviness. In this piece right here, Rachel Whiteread House, she suggests the great weight and solidity of this piece right here. And so she fills the entire house with concrete and then pulls away the exterior walls, right? So it's kind of like a mold. So like opening the ceiling, pouring all this concrete into the walls, and then peeling off, and you see this piece. The empty volume in the exterior is turned into a memorial of the lives of the people who used to live in it, right? So the walls are filled with concrete, but then there's that interior space that's actually empty. This is The Kiss. And so in this piece, Brancusi, and then another piece, the same title, The Kiss, is from Rodin. And so these two pieces are interesting when we talk about form, because when you're using mass to describe love, you have to think about that idea of these two different forms and what they're communicating, right? And so obviously, if you're thinking about the idea of how does an artist communicate love, how do they describe love? And so Rodin creates these two images, figures, in they're kind of sitting and embraced in each other's arms and kissing. And so this would be the idea of love. But then we see Brancusi have these two, the couple here that's embraced, but the form is so different and it's very abstract. But yet, if you think about these two, and you think about the kind of communication that that form creates, right? These really natural images and figures, yes, they do describe the idea of love. But if you look at Brancusi's idea, like the two lovers are unified, they're like eye to eye, mouth to mouth, and I mean they're just like completely stuck together. And so for him, this is a better description of love because they're unified together, right? And so in a sense, those are some of the things that you could talk about when you're looking at these sculpture pieces and talking about form and its intent and what it actually creates. This is Frank Gehry, Guggenheim Museum in Spain. And so with this piece here, this is actually located where it once was a center for shipbuilding. And so he tried to kind of create this building and to kind of extend that into the space of like a huge boat, right? So that it kind of ties into that environment. So this is a good example of how an artist uses form to kind of represented an idea in the artwork, right? Trying to kind of build it in and blend into the environment. With three-dimensional forms, we're also going to encounter the idea of texture. And so if you think about this kind of tactile sensation and how we physically feel when we touch these things, right? So we rely mostly on the impressions we receive from our heads when we look at something. And a lot of times artists will like kind of play with us, like, because we already have this kind of preconceived idea of what something feels. But then as you look at the surface, you can imagine the textures, your past experiences, and then once you touch it, it's very different. This is Cloudgate by Anish Kapoor. And there's actually one of his sculptures are here in Houston in downtown, the Museum of Fine Arts and the Sculpture Garden. So if you ever get a chance to go out there, you can go see one of his works here in Houston. But if you look at this piece, the actual texture is when you go and you touch it, it's really highly polished, so it's really smooth. And what's really cool about this piece is that the form reflects the city of Chicago. So what the artist was really doing was wanted the viewers to interact with this like really slick sculpture. You go up, you touch it, you feel it. And then also you can still see that like that you're still in that part of the city. Like it's part of it. It's not just like a sculpture sitting in the middle there. So if we were looking at this sculpture right here, she's got the whole world in her. And we were talking about an analysis, and we're talking about texture. Was texture important in this piece? You could probably say that yes, it is. And so as you look closer into the piece, you realize that you're seeing this female figure surrounded by natural texture. So you have all this wood, these animal horns, and so everything's very rough. There's paper mache, and so that feel and that texture are probably going to play a role in the way you interpret the piece, how you feel about the piece, also because it is it gives you a certain feel to it, right? And so it almost looks very dangerous, and so you can talk about that texture and the feelings that come with it. With subversive texture, this type of texture kind of like takes our previous experiences and then contradicts that, right? And so this is where I was talking about that idea of how artists will sometimes trick you or try to bring something different from the artwork, right? So an artist will use subversive texture to invite you to come in and to kind of reconsider your preconceptions of things. So for example, in Oppenheim's Object, she uses texture to kind of contradict our logical experiences of things, right? So here we see a fur-covered cup, a saucer, and a spoon. And when you think about just a cup, a saucer, and a spoon, in your head, you already have that experience that you've had before, having a cup to your mouth and it's smooth, touching a spoon and a spoon in your mouth. But then if you think about this texture, like if you were to pick up that cup and put it to your mouth, that texture is so different, right? This is subversive texture. And so really counting on this kind of tactile memory to conflict with the actual experience that you're having at the moment.